Before Amber Frey. Before the cameras. Before the courtroom. Scott Peterson looked like a dream husband. Polite, gentle, easygoing. But behind closed doors, his calmness wasn't love. It was detachment. It was calculation. It was the first warning sign that would eventually lead to the disappearance of his pregnant wife, Laci. This is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of a man who hid every red flag in plain sight. The mask Scott Peterson wore, and how it hid every red flag. Before Scott Peterson became a household name, before the media storm, before the courtroom cameras, before the world saw the photographs of a beautiful pregnant woman smiling with hope, there was only a love story, a simple one, a gentle one, the kind that blindsides you because it looks safe. When Laci first met Scott, he walked into her life like someone carefully designed to impress. He wasn't loud. He wasn't bold. He wasn't the kind of man who swept a room with charisma. No, Scott's charm came in a quieter form. A perfectly pressed collar, a well-timed smile, soft, polite tones, a kind of warmth that seemed calm and comforting. He looked like stability. He sounded like responsibility. He appeared to be the kind of man who built a steady life and protected it. But here is the truth that echoes through every tragedy like this. Some men don't reveal their darkness through anger. Some don't show their danger through aggression. Some hide it behind calmness. In psychology, this type of persona often belongs to individuals who have learned how to perform normalcy. They mirror the emotions they think they are supposed to have. They mimic the behavior of a caring partner. They construct an identity built on predictable reactions and pleasant surfaces. And from the very beginning, Scott Peterson was performing. The performance of perfection. Laci's friends remember Scott as nice, respectful, polite. Her family thought he was dependable, grounded, and even shy. He offered help when asked. He smiled in photos. He showed up for holiday dinners. He knew how to introduce himself to parents and earn approval. Everything seemed consistent. But the first red flag, the one that is almost always ignored, is that it was too consistent. People who are emotionally complex, flawed, layered, and authentic have ups and downs. They show irritation. They show excitement. They show insecurity. They show stress. They show joy. They show fear. They show depth. But people who wear masks rarely do. Scott's emotional expression in early years was flat, not in a disturbing way, but in a controlled way. His reactions were measured, predictable, gentle, and safe. Not because he was an emotionally healthy man, but because he carefully avoided revealing anything real. He was smooth, not genuine. Calm, not connected. Present, but not engaged. People often misunderstand calmness as a sign of reliability. But calmness can also be a sign of emotional detachment. The man who avoided being known. The early relationship between Scott and Laci had another subtle warning sign. Laci talked about Scott more than Scott talked about himself. She shared his hobbies, his interests, his career, his goals. But very few friends could recall Scott opening up deeply about his inner world. It wasn't shyness. It wasn't introversion. It was avoidance. Scott avoided vulnerability so smoothly that no one questioned it. A man who avoids being known is often a man who fears being exposed. Red flag number 1. Emotional impersonation. Scott didn't have real emotional responses. He had versions of them, carefully chosen, curated, correct responses. If Laci was excited, he offered soft encouragement. If she was sad, he offered quiet support. If she talked about dreams, he nodded and echoed them, but he rarely initiated emotional connection. He rarely drove deep conversations. He rarely shared his own feelings unless the moment demanded it. This is one of the most dangerous red flags, because it looks healthy. To anyone outside the relationship, Scott seemed like the perfect partner. Not controlling, not explosive, not moody, not dismissive. But people who impersonate emotions are not emotionally invested. They are playing roles. Scott didn't grow with Laci emotionally. He simply matched her energy enough to keep her feeling secure. Red flag number 2. Too calm, too quiet, too smooth. Most people think red flags come from intensity, yelling, threats, fights. But Scott's danger came from the opposite. He never argued passionately, never raised his voice, never showed intense frustration, never broke down emotionally, never expressed deep affection either. He lived emotionally in the middle, all the time. No peaks, no valleys. A man who never shows emotional discomfort is often a man who suppresses, compartmentalizes, avoids accountability, hides his inner world. This calmness became the foundation that later made Scott believable to so many people. But that same calmness is what made him capable of hiding an affair, lying effortlessly, and maintaining two identities without breaking. Red flag number 3. The need to be liked, not loved. Scott cared deeply about being liked. By friends, by coworkers, by strangers, by acquaintances. But being liked is not the same as being connected. Laci loved him. Scott wanted to be admired. In relationships, people who crave admiration over connection often avoid accountability, avoid real intimacy, maintain a surface-level persona, prioritize how they are seen rather than who they are, make decisions based on image, not morality. When someone prioritizes being perceived as a good man, it's often because they are not one internally. Red flag number 4. A man who took more comfort than he gave. In the early years, Laci was affectionate, energetic, expressive, and supportive. She adored Scott. She proudly talked about him. She poured warmth into the relationship. Scott received that warmth. But he rarely returned it in equal measure. People who knew them never described Scott as madly in love, obsessed with Laci, or emotionally devoted. They described him as nice, pleasant, a good husband, a decent man, no passion, no depth, just agreeable. A man can treat you kindly and still not love you deeply. A man can treat you gently and still be emotionally unavailable. A man can smile with you and still lie to you. Scott was the kind of partner who filled the space beside you, but not the space within you. Laci didn't notice this because she filled that space herself with her love, her loyalty, and her dreams. And that is often how tragedies like this begin. Not with violence, not with screaming, not with threats, but with a man so emotionally flat, so quiet, so agreeable, that no one sees the darkness he hides. Not even the woman who loves him most. Period. End period. The quiet behaviors that revealed who Scott really was. From the outside, the Peterson marriage looked ordinary, calm, even idyllic. They were the attractive young couple living in a charming Modesto neighborhood. They hosted dinners. They attended family gatherings. They took photos that now appear in documentaries. smiling, relaxed, seemingly in sync. But behind that facade, there were subtle patterns forming. Not dramatic, not violent, not chaotic, which is exactly why they were missed. Many people assume red flags are loud, but in Scott's case, the warnings were quiet. They were woven into the fabric of the relationship itself. And most importantly, they were hidden behind a truth that makes cases like this so heartbreaking. Laci was the kind of woman who loved with her whole heart, so she noticed Scott's needs, not his shortcomings. Red flag number 5. He let Laci carry the marriage. Every relationship has a natural balance. Sometimes one partner is more emotional, sometimes more logical, sometimes more expressive. But in healthy marriages, both people share responsibility. In the Peterson marriage, Laci was the engine, the planner, the communicator, the organizer, the emotional backbone, the social connector, the domestic decision-maker, the future builder. And Scott? He was the passenger. He offered small contributions, enough to appear cooperative, but he never took leadership in the relationship. He didn't drive major decisions. He didn't take emotional responsibility. He didn't initiate meaningful conversations. He followed, quietly, comfortably, almost passively. A marriage where one partner carries all the weight, emotionally, socially, and practically, is not a marriage built on love. It is a marriage built on convenience for the passive partner. Red flag number 6. He was emotionally present only when it benefited him. Scott wasn't cold. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant in a dramatic way. He simply connected when it was easy, when it was expected, when it made him look like a good husband. But when the emotional stakes rose, when Laci needed deeper intimacy, reassurance, or vulnerability, Scott retreated, not outwardly, not rudely, not in a way anyone would confront. It was more like an internal shutdown. Laci would express excitement about the baby. Scott would nod politely. Laci would talk about nursery ideas. Scott would respond with generic support. Laci would discuss the future with warmth. Scott would offer calm agreement. This dynamic is common in relationships with emotionally avoidant partners. They are there physically, but absent emotionally. And over time, this creates imbalance. One partner pouring love in, the other quietly absorbing it without giving it back. Red flag number 7. Scott didn't share Laci's joy about fatherhood. You don't need to be a perfect husband to show excitement about becoming a father. You don't need to be expressive. You don't need to cry tears of joy. But you do need to show something. And Scott showed nothing. Not fear, not joy, not nervousness, not anticipation. He was neutral, dangerously neutral. A baby represents responsibility, identity, sacrifice, future, stability. For most men, that creates at least some emotional reaction. But Scott treated the pregnancy like a logistical update, something to acknowledge, but not feel. And neutrality in the face of life-changing events tells you something profound. Scott did not see himself as part of a growing family. He saw himself as a man whose freedom was getting smaller. Red flag number 8. A growing need for escape. One of the key psychological indicators in cases like this is the shift from minor emotional withdrawal to lifestyle withdrawal. It starts small, staying late at work, zoning out during conversations, avoiding shared decisions, showing less interest in future planning, engaging more with hobbies that create distance. By mid-2002, Scott Peterson had begun carving out a private space inside his marriage, mentally, emotionally, and secretly. Laci was planning a nursery. Scott was planning a separate life. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was directional. They were moving forward together on the surface, but Scott was mentally drifting backward. Red flag number 9, passive man who never said no out loud. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about Scott Peterson is that he was easygoing. But easygoing isn't always a personality trait. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism. Scott rarely said things like, "I don't want that. I disagree. I'm unhappy. I need something different." Why? Because direct communication creates accountability. And accountability creates vulnerability. Instead, Scott controlled situations through silence. When a man avoids honesty because it requires emotional work, he becomes increasingly likely to lie, hide, withdraw, manipulate. It was strategic. Red flag number 10. He was comfortable with Laci doing the emotional work. When a woman is naturally giving, expressive, and loving, it is easy for a partner to slip into passive acceptance without realizing the damage they're causing. Place gave affection, ideas, energy, optimism, forgiveness, understanding. Scott took comfort, admiration, stability, emotional labor without matching it. Not because he didn't appreciate her, but because he didn't know how to love deeply. And this imbalance allowed Scott to develop two lives, the life Laci saw and the life he hid behind a polite smile. The most dangerous imbalance of all. As Laci moved deeper into motherhood, she became more emotionally invested in the marriage. As Scott moved deeper into fatherhood, he became more emotionally disconnected. She was expanding love. He was shrinking from. And this created a situation that is tragically common in cases where husbands commit family murder. One partner feels their world growing, the other feels their freedom dying. Laci saw a future. Scott saw an exit. Laci grew more attached. Scott detached further. Laci wanted stability. Scott wanted escape. Laci believed in marriage. Scott believed in appearance. By the time the affair began, the marriage was not in crisis. It was in imbalance. And imbalance is where red flags hide best. Not in shouting, not in threats, not in chaos, but in silence, in withdrawal, in a man who is present in the home, but absent in the relationship. The affair, the lies, and the moment Scott stopped pretending. Not with violence, not with anger, but with deceit so calculated, it revealed a truth that no one around Scott had seen before. He was already living a second life, long before Laci disappeared. To the outside world, everything looked normal in late 2002. Laci was glowing with excitement as her due date approached. She prepared the nursery. She decorated for Christmas. She attended holiday gatherings. She talked about names for the baby, Connor. And Scott? He was making secret phone calls. He was attending hidden meetings. He was lying with ease. He was creating a parallel reality. One without Laci, without Connor, without responsibility. A world where he was free. Most men who cheat still maintain some emotional tether to their marriage. They feel guilt. They wrestle with contradictions. They fear consequences. But Scott's affair with Amber Frey was different. Because for him, the affair wasn't just about lust, or escape, or thrill. It was about identity. It was about the life he truly wanted. And that life did not include being a husband or a father. Red flag number 11. The affair was not impulsive. It was calculated. Many affairs begin with emotional dissatisfaction, arguments, or loneliness. This wasn't the case for Scott. He didn't cheat because he and Laci were fighting. He didn't cheat because the marriage was falling apart. He didn't cheat because he was overwhelmed by fatherhood. He cheated because he didn't want the life he had committed to. Amber wasn't a reaction. She was a plan. Scott met her, pursued her, and built a world with her, meticulously. He lied about being single. Then he lied about being recently widowed. He created a fictional identity to cut ties with his real life. This is extremely rare. Cheaters lie about their marital status, but they don't usually lie about their wives being dead. That is not the mindset of a man who is struggling. It's the mindset of a man who is rewriting his life. Psychologists call this future orientation deception. When someone lies about a future reality they plan to create. Scott told Amber he was widowed before Laci ever disappeared. Let that sink in. This was not an affair. It was a rehearsal. Red flag number 12. Scott lived the affair as if it were his real life. Amber later testified that Scott did not act like a man living in two worlds. He acted like a man living in one. Hers. These were not the behaviors of a guilty husband. He attended parties with her. He met her friends. He talked about goals. He showed public affection. He behaved like a single man. And here's the chilling part. Scott never slipped. Not once. Most men juggling an affair panic, hide, get sloppy, make mistakes. Scott was seamless, effortless. He presented himself as a man with no wife, no obligations, no child on the way, emotionally, mentally, and behaviorally. Scott had already divorced Laci in his mind, but not legally, not verbally, not through honesty, through deception. Red flag number 13. He lied smoothly, without hesitation, without emotion. People who lie usually show stress signals, nervous tone, inconsistent details, hesitation, defensive behavior. But Scott had none of these. Amber later said, "He lied as easily as he breathed." This is not typical behavior. It is not normal for the average unfaithful partner. This is pathological lying, rooted in entitlement and emotional detachment. Scott lied because lying was easier than telling the truth. He lied because the truth would require accountability. He lied because he saw people not as partners, but as obstacles or utilities. And there was something even more disturbing. He lied for fun. Amber remembered him telling dramatic stories about his dead wife, inventing details, adding emotion, sharing memories that never existed. People who lie for gain do so strategically. People who lie for comfort do so impulsively. But people who lie for performance, that's psychological danger. Scott lied because it gave him control, because it allowed him to create the world he wanted, and because in his second life, he got to be the man he wished he were. Red flag number 14. He showed no remorse for his deception. While Amber thought she was dating a kind, soft-spoken widower, Laci was home preparing for Christmas, decorating, wrapping gifts, getting the nursery ready, growing a child. But not once did Scott express guilt, fear, or emotional conflict. He didn't distance himself from Amber. He didn't break up with her. He didn't slow the relationship down. He didn't even hide his happiness with her. Scott had no emotional conflict because he had no emotional bond. Not to Laci, not to the baby, not to the life he committed to. Scott's internal struggle didn't exist because Scott himself didn't exist. Not the version Laci thought she married. The real Scott was a man who needed freedom more than intimacy. A man who believed his desires mattered more than anyone's future. A man who saw consequences as inconveniences, not responsibilities. Red flag number 15, a drastic personality shift before the disappearance. In the weeks leading up to Laci's disappearance, Scott exhibited a sudden shift in behavior. He grew unusually calm. He stopped engaging in future planning. He became more distant at home. He disappeared for long periods. He increased lies. He acted as if he was living on autopilot. And to many investigators, this is one of the biggest red flags before domestic crimes. Men who plan escape or violence often enter a psychological detachment phase, a strange calmness, a chilling sense of peace, a focus on the other life they believe is waiting. Scott behaved not like a man excited for fatherhood, but like a man counting down to a deadline. Laci didn't realize this shift was not stress, not work, not fatigue. It was the beginning of his exit strategy. Red flag number 16, the pre-death lies to Amber. This is the red flag that still shocks people most. As Christmas approached, Scott told Amber, "This will be my first holiday without my wife." He told her that on December 9th. Laci disappeared on December 24th. He spoke about her in the past tense 2 weeks before she vanished. This is not coincidence. This is not confusion. This is not emotional distance. This is forethought. He was preparing his new identity for Amber, planting the idea he was widowed, and shaping a narrative that would make his transition seamless. This is not the behavior of a man who snapped. This is not the behavior of a man overwhelmed. This is not the behavior of a man who made a mistake. This is the behavior of a man building an alibi before committing the act. When Scott lied about being widowed, he was rehearsing, practicing, preparing. He was building his second life before destroying the first. And Laci, 33 weeks pregnant, beautiful, hopeful, excited, never saw it. Because Scott hid his red flags behind silence, behind calmness, behind a gentle voice, and behind the most dangerous mask a man can wear. The mask of a perfect husband who never existed at all. The disappearance, the timeline, and the red flags that became impossible to ignore. December 24th, 2002, began like any ordinary winter morning in Modesto. Cold air, quiet neighborhoods, families preparing for Christmas Eve traditions. It should have been a day of warmth, anticipation, and celebration. Instead, it became the day the world learned Scott Peterson was not who he claimed to be. But what makes this case uniquely disturbing is not just what happened to Laci, it's how Scott behaved before, during, and after her disappearance. Because on that day, every red flag that had been hidden behind politeness, calmness, and charm began to reveal itself, one by one. And the transformation was not explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Chillingly subtle. Unnaturally subtle. That's what made it so terrifying. The morning of December 24th, a timeline that never made emotional sense. Scott's version of events on the morning of Laci's disappearance has been repeated countless times. On paper, it sounds simple, but emotionally, psychologically, and behaviorally, nothing about his morning made sense. According to Scott, he woke up late. Laci was watching Martha Stewart. He decided to go fishing alone. He loaded his truck with random items. He left Laci at home with the dog. Then he returned hours later to find her gone. This is the surface version. But when investigators dug into the emotional patterns behind these actions, a series of red flags emerged that any behavioral analyst immediately recognized. Because nothing Scott did that morning reflected the behavior of an excited soon-to-be father, a loving husband, or even a minimally concerned partner. Instead, it reflected something else. A man following a script he rehearsed. Red flag. 17. The boat, the trip, and the impossible coincidence. Scott claimed he decided on a whim to go fishing alone on Christmas Eve. Not only is this unusual, this is an emotional impossibility for a man expecting a child in weeks. He made himself unreachable. He went to a marina where he had only recently bought a secret boat. He had never told Laci about it. He had barely used it. He had no plan for the day. He told no one where he was going. This secrecy wasn't ordinary. It was strategic. Investigators later discovered Scott purchased the boat quietly, paid in cash, and did not register it as required. That is not an impulsive fishing trip. That is a prepared escape route, or a potential disposal method. And yet Scott's calm explanation never wavered. Red flag number 18. The strange items in the truck. When Scott drove to the marina, he loaded his truck with an umbrella, a blow dryer, tools, and random household items. Investigators found this bizarre. Criminal psychologists found it revealing. This type of junk loading is common when individuals try to disguise the one incriminating item, create confusion, appear casual, dilute the suspicious object among everyday clutter. If a body or heavy object had been transported that morning, those items would serve as camouflage. But the strangest part, Scott never gave a clear explanation for them. Because manufactured stories always have gaps. Red flag number 19. Zero emotion when he reported Laci missing. When Scott returned that evening and realized Laci was gone, his reaction was chillingly out of sync with reality. He did not panic, search frantically, call hospitals, call friends, call neighbors, call police immediately. Instead, he calmly washed his clothes, ate pizza, took a shower, left a voicemail that sounded like a work call. This lack of urgency is textbook behavioral red flag. In true missing persons cases, husbands tear through the neighborhood, knock on doors, call friends, pace in panic, call police within minutes. But Scott acted as though nothing was wrong. This wasn't shock. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't emotional shutdown. It was the calm of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Red flag number 20. His voice was flat, scripted, and emotionless. In recorded calls to Laci's mother, friends, and eventually police, Scott spoke in the same routine tone he used in business meetings. No fear. No tremble. No panic. Just flatness. If you listen to the recordings, you hear a man calmly giving bullet points. Laci's not home. Her car is in the driveway. I'm not sure where she went. No escalation in tone. No urgency. No emotional breaks. A pregnant wife missing on Christmas Eve would cause absolute emotional collapse in any loving husband. But Scott's voice had no cracks, because Scott's emotions were not attached to the situation. His emotions were attached to the performance. Red flag number 21. He never joined the search for Laci. When friends, family, neighbors, and even strangers began searching for Laci, Scott did not join them. He did not walk the neighborhood, did not knock on doors, did not comb the fields. did not check parks, did not retrace steps. He avoided the search completely. Instead, he stayed home, made odd phone calls, kept a low emotional profile, monitored news updates, maintained contact with Amber Frey. Think about that. While hundreds of people were searching for his pregnant wife, Scott was calling his girlfriend. In Amber's phone logs, he even told her, "I'm in Paris for the holidays." A breathtaking lie. He was not in Paris. He was at home, pretending to be a widower, pretending Laci was already gone. Because in Scott's mind, she was. Red flag number 22. He showed more emotion with reporters than he did with family. When the cameras arrived, Scott suddenly became expressive. He frowned, made dramatic eye contact, used emotional pauses, mentioned memories, talked about hope. To the untrained eye, this looked like grief, but to experts, it looked like performance. Why? Because Scott only showed emotion when he had an audience. Behind cameras, he was cold, quiet, and bored. In front of cameras, he acted. This is classic impression management. When someone behaves differently, depending on whether they are being observed. Scott's grief was not grief. It was strategy. Red flag number 23. He never asked who took her, or is she safe? In every missing persons case involving spouses, the first questions are always, who could have taken her? Is she safe? What do we do? But Scott asked, what do we tell the media? What do the detectives know? What do I say in interviews? He aligned his behavior with media strategy, not with genuine fear. His mind wasn't on Laci. It was on himself, on controlling the narrative, on controlling his image, on controlling suspicion. That mentality is not just suspicious. It is revealing, because innocent men fear outcomes. Men fear exposure. Red flag number 24. He never spoke about Connor. This red flag is small, but enormous in meaning. In every interview, every phone call, every conversation, Scott rarely mentioned the baby. Not hope, not fear, not protectiveness, not concern, nothing. It was as if Connor did not exist to him, because in Scott's mind, he didn't. Not as a son, not as a future. The only life Scott cared about was the one he imagined, in which he was single, child-free, and unburdened. The day after, another behavioral break. On December 25th, Scott did something that shocked investigators most. He went golfing. Not searching, not begging for help, not falling apart. Golfing. He told people he needed time to clear his head. Except guilty men don't need to clear their heads. They need to avoid acting too emotional too soon. The calmness Scott projected was not peace. It was detachment. The double life becomes the only life. By December 26th, detectives were already suspicious. But Scott was not worried, because Scott believed he had already reinvented himself with Amber. He believed the lie more than the truth. He believed the performance more than the marriage. And he believed arrogantly that he could outsmart everyone. But what Scott did not expect was that his emotional red flags would betray him long before the physical evidence did. How Scott's behavior exposed him more than the evidence ever did. In every major criminal case, there is a turning point, a moment when suspicion shifts from possibility to certainty. Sometimes it's a piece of forensic evidence. Sometimes it's a confession. Sometimes it's a witness. But in the case of Scott Peterson, the moment investigators turned their focus on him did not come from DNA or fingerprints, or even the discovery of Laci and Connor. It came from Scott himself, because Scott's behavior in the days and weeks after Laci's disappearance revealed more truth than any crime scene ever could. And that truth was simple. Scott Peterson behaved like a man who had already moved on. He behaved like a man living a new life. He behaved like a man closing a chapter he believed no one would ever reopen. But he also behaved like a man who underestimated the world watching. Red flag number 25. A disturbing lack of grief or panic. When detectives first interacted with Scott, they didn't expect immediate answers. They didn't expect instant clarity. They expected emotions: fear, confusion, anger, sadness, shock. But Scott showed none of those. Instead, detectives noted his tone was flat. His answers were rehearsed. His face was relaxed. His body language calm. His timeline strangely smooth. His eye contact controlled. His emotional range non-existent. Detective Al Brocchini later said, Scott's affect was off. He acted like he was describing someone else's missing wife, not his own. This wasn't stoicism. This was emotional detachment. And emotional detachment can be many things. But in missing spouse cases, it is almost always a red flag. Red flag number 26. He focused more on image than on. Laci's disappearance wants action. He wants urgency. He wants action, period. What are people saying about me? Not. Where is Laci? Is she safe? What else can I do? Not a life or death emergency. This obsession with image is a core characteristic of narcissistic offenders. They fear judgment more than consequences. They fear disgrace more than guilt. They fear losing control of the narrative more than losing a loved one. Scott was no exception. Red flag number 27. He lied when there was no need to lie. Detectives noticed immediately that Scott lied about small things that had no logical reason to be lied about. He lied about what time he left home, what he was doing at the warehouse, whether he told Laci where he was going, the fishing location, the boat frequency, the lost receipts, phone calls he made, the clothes he wore. These were not strategic lies, not protective lies, not panic lies. They were compulsive lies. Investigators call this gratuitous deception, lying simply because lying is more comfortable than telling the truth. To detectives, it screamed of two things. He was hiding something, and he was used to hiding. Red flag number 28. The affair becomes public, and Scott panics. Up to this point, Scott was calm, cold, control-oriented. But that changed the moment the affair was revealed. Initially, Amber Frey had no idea who she was dating, until police told her the truth and asked for her help. Amber agreed. Immediately, and suddenly, Scott's double life collapsed in real time. For the first time since Laci vanished, Scott panicked. Not because Amber was hurt. Not because the truth was out. Not because of guilt. He panicked because his second life, the life he loved most, was slipping away. From that moment forward, Scott's behavior stopped resembling a grieving husband and began resembling a trapped fugitive. Red flag number 29. Scott told Amber more lies while his wife was missing. Even after Amber learned the truth and started cooperating with police, Scott kept calling her. And the things he told her were some of the most revealing statements in the entire investigation. He said he was in Paris, at a work conference, with friends, grieving, struggling, alone, devastated. He even told Amber he was watching fireworks, on. New Year's Eve in Eiffel Tower Square, a place that doesn't exist. This is something detectives still emphasize today. Scott showed far more emotion in those phone calls to Amber than he ever did while speaking about Laci. Because the lies he told Amber, "You're not about survival," they were about fantasy. Scott was more invested in maintaining the illusion of being a widowed bachelor than he was in finding his missing wife. That was not a slip of judgment. That was the truth. Red flag number 30. He appeared annoyed by the investigation. As days turned into weeks, Scott began showing irritation toward detectives, reporters, and volunteers. He complained about media attention, police pressure, public suspicion, the search taking too long, the cameras outside the house. A grieving husband begs detectives to do more. A guilty husband complains they are doing too much. At one point, Scott even said, "This is taking up my whole life." His wife was missing. His unborn son was missing. And Scott's concern was inconvenience. Red flag number 31. He showed no connection to the baby. In interviews, detectives noticed something chilling. Scott never spoke about Connor as a person. He referred to the baby as the situation, the pregnancy, or simply avoided mentioning him at all. This emotional absence is an enormous red flag in domestic homicide cases, because men who eliminate their pregnant partners almost always view the unborn child as a burden, a responsibility, or a threat to their freedom. Connor wasn't real to Scott. Not emotionally, not psychologically, and not in the world Scott imagined for himself. Red flag number 32. The car, the cash, and the disguises. Investigation tightened. Scott began quietly preparing for something, and detectives noticed. He bought a car in his mother's name, kept thousands of dollars in cash, carried multiple cell phones, had camping gear, had a nearly unrecognizable beard, claimed he was moving around for privacy. But detectives knew what this was. It was a flight kit, a plan B, a way out. Scott wasn't trying to cope with grief. He was preparing for escape. And in April 2003, the day Laci and Connor's bodies washed ashore, Scott was arrested with his brother's ID, his mother's car, cash, survival gear, and a route toward the Mexico border. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't panic. This was foresight. This was preparation. This was exactly what Scott always did: build a second life when the first one became inconvenient. Scott's red flags were no longer subtle, no longer quiet, no longer hidden. They were loud, visible, and undeniable. He wasn't behaving like a man in pain. He was behaving like a man whose plan was falling apart, and he was trying desperately to outrun the truth. The courtroom behavior, the psychology, and the red flags that couldn't be hidden. By the time Scott Peterson entered the courtroom, the world already had an opinion. Some saw him as a monster. Others, surprisingly, still saw him as too normal to be guilty. But in that trial room, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in his life, Scott couldn't control the narrative. He couldn't charm his way out. He couldn't hide behind politeness, calmness, or emotional distance. Every lie, every deception, every shift in behavior was laid bare. And as the weeks passed, the jury didn't just see the facts. They saw the red flags that had been there all along, patterns of psychology, behavior, and manipulation that no innocent man could explain away. This wasn't just a trial. It was the complete unmasking, of who Scott Peterson truly was. Red flag. Asterisk 33. Most people entering a courtroom for a capital murder trial display clear emotional reactions: fear, trembling, anxiety, sadness. But Scott Peterson was eerily calm. Not stoic, not composed, calm. His posture relaxed, his expressions neutral, his reactions flat. He didn't cry, he didn't break down, he didn't show worry. He looked like a man attending a meeting, not a man facing death row. Jurors repeatedly said that Scott's lack of emotion made them suspicious. One juror recalled, "It felt like he was waiting for someone else's trial to end, not his." Another said, "He didn't act like a man grieving his wife. He acted like a man inconvenienced by the process." This indifference wasn't new. It was the same emotional void. Scott showed his entire life. But in the courtroom, that void became evidence. Red flag number 34. He showed more emotion watching Amber's testimony than he ever did hearing about Laci. The moment Amber Frey took the stand became one of the defining moments of the trial. Amber, quiet, sincere, honest, detailed every lie Scott told her. She played recordings of Scott pretending to be in Paris on New Year's Eve, while the entire state was searching for his pregnant wife. As Amber spoke, something shifted in Scott. For the first time in the trial, he showed emotion. He looked shaken, nervous, uncomfortable, almost panicked. But here is the chilling truth. He wasn't emotional because of Laci. He was emotional because Amber, his second life, his escape, his fantasy, was gone. A juror later said, "The only time Scott looked devastated was when his girlfriend testified, not when they talked about Laci and the baby." That single observation became one of the strongest behavioral red flags of the trial. Red flag number 35. His lies were too smooth, too convenient, too perfect. When Scott testified informally through taped interviews and police statements, prosecutors noticed something odd. His lies were consistent. Most people who lie under pressure get tangled in their own stories. They contradict themselves. They add unnecessary details. They struggle to keep timelines straight. But Scott didn't. His statements were clean, polished, rehearsed, unnervingly consistent. He had practiced. This consistency wasn't proof of innocence. It was proof of preparation. Even worse, he showed no emotional reaction to the horrifying details of the case. Photos of the shoreline, descriptions of the remains, the timeline of Laci's last known movements, the discovery of Connor. Scott looked like he was watching a weather report. That emotional disconnection was impossible for the jury to ignore. Red flag number 36. He seemed annoyed, not heartbroken. Jurors reported that Scott displayed sighing, boredom, irritation, restlessness, especially when police testified timeline inconsistencies were shown. His lies were played for the court. Amber's recordings were replayed. One courtroom observer said he rolled his eyes more than he cried. That behavior sends a very specific psychological message. Scott was not emotionally connected to the crime because he believed he was smarter than everyone in the courtroom. He wasn't mourning. He was frustrated. He wasn't grieving. He was annoyed. He wasn't breaking down. He was waiting to be released. Because Scott genuinely believed he could outsmart the justice system the same way he manipulated those around him. Red flag number 37. He showed no empathy for Laci's family. When prosecutors played emotional testimony from Laci's mother, father, siblings, and close friends, Scott did not look at them. Not once. He didn't bow his head, shed a tear, blink rapidly, breathe heavier, look distressed, look remorseful. He stared forward, stone-faced. A juror later said, his eyes were just empty. This wasn't nervousness. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't shock. It was absence. Because Scott had no empathy for the people who loved Laci, and no remorse for what they lost. Red flag number 38. He never took responsibility, even indirectly. Guilty men sometimes show guilt inadvertently. They apologize. They avoid certain topics. They show shame. They struggle to speak. They break down. But Scott didn't. He never said, I should have protected her. I feel responsible. I let her down. I failed her as a husband. Not even in a vague or symbolic way. His language was always, I don't know. I didn't do that. I can't explain. I wasn't there. I'm being misunderstood. It was the language of a man who saw himself as the victim. A man who believed the world owed him sympathy for his situation. Not the language of a grieving husband or an expectant father destroyed by loss. Red flag number 39. His reaction to the guilty verdict was telling. When the jury returned with the verdict, the moment was thick with emotion. Reporters cried. Even seasoned investigators wiped their eyes. No tears. No collapses. Just a blank stare. And a tightening of his jaw. And he had no outward emotional response. To the jury, this confirmed what they already knew. Scott Peterson was a man who could not feel what he had taken away from others. Not love. Not grief. Nothing. Red flag 40. His sentencing behavior revealed his true self. During sentencing, Laci's family gave emotional statements to the court. Her mother described the pain of losing her daughter and unborn grandson. Her stepfather spoke about the nightmares and the empty chair at every holiday. Her brother talked about the horror of knowing Laci spent her final moments with the man she trusted most. And Scott? Scott did not look at them. He did not cry. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He sat there with the same calm, blank expression he'd shown since day one. Because Scott Peterson didn't lose anything that mattered to him. He only lost things he pretended to care about. The mask was finally gone. The courtroom didn't just show the world the evidence. It showed the world who Scott Peterson was, a man who lived a double life, lied without hesitation, felt no empathy, sought admiration instead of love, valued freedom over responsibility, viewed people as tools, lacked genuine emotion, saw fatherhood as a burden, saw his wife as replaceable, and saw himself as the victim. The good husband image was gone. The charming persona was gone. The soft-spoken calmness was revealed for what it always was: emotional emptiness, a void where love should have been, A mask that finally cracked under truth. The final breakdown, the psychology and the truth about loving the wrong man. When we look back at cases like this, cases where a woman loves a man who ultimately destroys her life, we often search for a simple answer. How did she miss the signs? Why didn't she see it coming? Didn't she notice anything? Wasn't there a warning? But the truth is never simple. And the truth is never fair, because Laci Peterson didn't miss the red flags because she was naive or blind or careless. She missed them because Scott Peterson was skilled at hiding them. She missed them because the red flags were subtle, quiet, soft, slow, emotional instead of physical. She missed them because Scott didn't reveal himself through violence or anger. He revealed himself through calmness, distance, and emotional emptiness that looked on the surface like stability. The biggest red flags in this case were not the dramatic moments. They were the everyday moments that didn't look dangerous until you saw the tragedy they foreshadowed. And that's what makes this story so heartbreaking and so important. The truth behind why Laci didn't see it. The psychology of loving someone who never truly loved back. Laci was a woman who believed in love. She believed in family. She believed in marriage. She believed in Scott. She saw the man he pretended to be, not the man he truly was. And when someone is gentle, calm, soft-spoken, non-confrontational, and polite, you don't expect danger. You don't expect deception. You don't expect betrayal. You certainly don't expect murder. Because we are taught to fear the loud, the aggressive, the violent, the unpredictable. But sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who never raise their voice. The men who hide in politeness instead of rage. The men who manipulate with charm instead of force. The men who deceive with calmness instead of chaos. Those men are far harder to spot and far easier to trust. Laci wasn't blind. She was loving. And love sees the best in people, even when the truth is far darker. The real red flags, pieced together only in hindsight. When you place every moment of Scott's behavior side by side, a pattern emerges. A pattern that was invisible in real time, but undeniable in hindsight. He was emotionally flat. Not stable. Flat. He avoided conflict instead of resolving it. He withdrew instead of engaged. He depended on being liked, not being known. Admiration mattered more than intimacy. He lied, too. Easily. About little things. About big things. About everything. He detached from fatherhood. No excitement. No fear. No connection. He lived a double life effortlessly. No guilt. No hesitation. No remorse. He prepared for freedom long before Laci disappeared. The secret boat. The affair. The rehearsed stories, the cash, the ID, the route. He panicked only when his second life was threatened. Not when Laci was missing. Not when Connor was gone. Only when Amber's loyalty disappeared. He showed no empathy during the search. No urgency. No terror. No grief. He showed no emotion in court, except when Amber Frey testified. These red flags were not small. They were enormous, but they were invisible to the woman who loved him, because Scott disguised them as calmness, reliability, and gentleness. That is the signature of a man who hides who he is behind who he wants to appear to be. Why this story still matters. 2 decades later, people still study this case. Students, psychologists, detectives, relationship experts, criminologists, and especially women who see echoes of Scott's patterns in the men they've dated, married, or trusted. Because this case exposes a truth rarely talked about openly. Not all dangerous men look dangerous. Some look polite. Some look responsible. Some look harmless. Some look gentle. Some look like Scott Peterson. The danger isn't always in how a man acts. Sometimes the danger is in what he lacks: empathy, responsibility, accountability, depth, emotional connection, moral compass, commitment, remorse. Scott lacked them all, and yet he hid that truth behind a smile and a soft tone for years. That's why Laci couldn't see the red flags, because they didn't look like red flags at the time. They looked like a stable man who was simply quiet, reserved, and easygoing. Only after the tragedy did the truth reveal itself. He wasn't calm, he was empty. He wasn't easygoing, he was emotionally disconnected. He wasn't quiet, he was hiding. And he wasn't safe, he was dangerous in the most silent way possible. The final reflection. What we learn from Laci's story. Laci didn't fail. She didn't overlook. She didn't ignore. She didn't choose the wrong man knowingly. She loved in a world where people can hide who they are, behind soft voices and gentle smiles. And Scott hid well. He hid behind politeness, calmness, consistency, charm, quietness, emotional neutrality. He hid so well that even investigators took days to recognize the truth. Not because they were incompetent, but because Scott was exceptional at pretending. Laci believed in her husband because he gave her no reason not to, but he also gave her nothing real to hold on to. No vulnerability, no excitement, no accountability, no emotional breakthrough. She loved him fully. He loved no one completely, not even himself. The legacy of this case, the tragedy of Laci and Connor Peterson, remains one of the most haunting reminders that red flags aren't always loud. Sometimes they are quiet, subtle, gentle, disguised as stability, hidden in routines, masked by politeness. Scott didn't reveal himself through anger. He revealed himself through absence. He didn't scare Laci with aggression. He numbed her with emotional emptiness. He didn't show danger through chaos. He hid it behind calmness. That is why this case stays alive in our collective memory, because it teaches a lesson that is painful but necessary. Just because a man isn't dangerous in the obvious ways doesn't mean he's safe in the hidden ones. Check on the people you love. Look for the quiet signs. Trust your intuition. And never ignore the red flags that whisper instead of scream. Thank you for watching. This is your channel Hankshare, and I'll see you in the next documentary.